Welcome to this edition of Applied Animal Feeding. Today's video is going to talk about the importance of understanding livestock performance calculations and why, as budding animal scientists, we need to have an awareness of how we measure animal performance. And so when we're feeding livestock, we need to consider the fact that feed accounts for the majority of the variable costs that go into these livestock. So what I'm hoping that people can take in or prehend from this session, so to speak, is the importance of understanding the measures of performance, determine and apply an appropriate equation to measure animal performance, and practice the application of these measures of performance in scenarios that are similar to what happens in actual livestock operations. So let's talk about the application and value of measures of performance. When we make a decision that's going to regard the feeding of our livestock, we're impacting biological performance or being able to maximize or optimize the genetics of those animals that we are feeding. We need to consider the feed's impact on the environmental sustainability, as well as the economic sustainability for the producer. And so when we think we're just throwing some hay and grain out to some cows, really thought needs to be given to how is this going to affect my animal's biology? And am I going to see the rate of gain or the feed efficiency that I desire? Is there going to be excess waste from this diet that could potentially affect the environment? How is this going to play a role there? And bottom line, for most producers, am I going to get a positive return on my investment by making this decision? Is it going to help my profitability? And so it's more than just throwing some feed out to some animals. There's a little consideration. Now, do we go through this thought process every single time? Maybe not. But there's a nutritionist somewhere that formulated a ration that you may be using that has considered all three of these potential impact areas for using that ration. So as a student of agriculture, not only do you need to be able to evaluate feeding programs, you need to be able to use some production and financial metrics to support evidence-based management decisions. I get a lot of questions about, Selena, why do we do that in this class, in my Animal Science 230 class, Applied Feeds and Feeding? Well, when feed is over 60% of the cost of production, having an idea of decisions that you make in fact impacting the economics of the operation go hand in hand. And so it is important that beginning agriculture students, no matter where you're at, you develop an understanding of these measures of performance. And so the reason that these metrics matter is we've talked about feed is the largest variable cost in livestock production. If you're able to make a positive impact on your feed costs, then that sets you ahead of a lot of people. Biological performance, just maximizing rate of gain or feed efficiency, does not always equal profitability based on cost. So we've got to balance some of these parameters that we mentioned earlier together, like balancing the economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, and that biological performance. Third, producers have to adapt on the fly to adapt different feeding strategies to the changing markets, feed and livestock markets. As animal prices go up, maybe we've got to do something with the feed ration to reduce cost, to compensate for some of that. Lots of things going on. And I love animal nutrition because it is different every day, every year, every season. And finally, performance metrics support that data-driven decision-making and helps mitigate risk if you have a good understanding of how these numbers work. We're going to use an example of the Hernandez Beef Systems. And I've got it written out as well, but this is just a scenario. Alejandro Hernandez of Hernandez Beef Systems purchased 500 steers that weighed 825 pounds at the seller's ranch. When those steers arrived at their feedlot for processing, the steers weighed 805. Alejandro paid $285 per hundredweight on the loading weight for the steers. These steers were on feed for 150 days and finished at 1,350 pounds. Each steer consumed 3,400 pounds of feed on average, and the feed cost was $255 a ton. They did have a 1.25% death loss and sold the remaining steers for $230 per hundredweight. It's a lot of information packed into that. And so we're going to unpack that and learn. And in the process of unpacking this scenario, we're going to learn about 11 different measures of performance that we can pull out of this one scenario. So if you'd like to, I'll take a second. You can screenshot this if you would like. All right. So I have jotted down Alejandro's scenario right here with the same information that was just on the video. But these are the 11 measures of performance that we're going to learn about. The percent shrink, the average daily gain, feed efficiency, how to calculate the initial value of an animal, the final sale value of an animal, adjusted number of animals sold when accounting for death loss, the total feed cost per animal, the feed only cost to gain. Cost to gain can be a lot of different things included. Just for our purposes, we're going to do feed only, cost to gain. Break-even cost, margin, and the return on gain. So those are the 11 measures that we're going to be using for this scenario. Then we also have a dairy scenario with a measure of performance in the dairy industry that we'll talk about. Okay, so we talked about shrink. And shrink is usually expressed as a percentage. And when we're talking about shrink, that's simply the amount of weight they lost when they traveled. A lot of times animals have to go a really long distance. And so sometimes we have to take into account how much shrink they're going to have before they get to a feedlot. We don't have a lot of shrink when we take our sheep to our meat slab, which is only like 100 yards away, if that. And so when we sell lambs to the meat slab, we account for a 3% shrink because they're eating that cost of a full rumen and all of those things. So shrink is how much weight those animals will lose, the difference between that full weight and an empty weight of an animal. Okay? And so we're going to calculate it on a percentage basis. So it's simply the full weight minus the empty weight. Okay, that's the shrink. And if we divide that shrink by the full weight times 100, that's going to give us our shrink percentage. So in our scenario with Alejandro, we can refer back to the full weight when they at the ranch when they bought the animals was 825 pounds. When they arrived for processing, they weighed 805 pounds. Okay, so now we know the difference between the empty and the full weight. We're going to put that over the full weight times 100. I'm going to bring out the good old calculator here. The old school ranchers would be doing this in their head. I, unfortunately, am not one of those. And also, so you guys can see how I plug it in. All right, so let's first do the difference in the actual shrink. So that full weight minus the empty weight. So the 825 minus the 805 gives us 20 pounds that they shrunk. So all we're wanting to know is what percentage that is of that full weight. So we're going to take that answer and divide it by the full weight and multiply times 100. So those steers shrunk about 2.42% in traveling from the seller's ranch to the buyer's ranch. That's all shrink is. The full weight minus the empty weight divided by the full weight. Okay, so performance measure 1 is done. Okay, so if we come back to our list of ones that we're going to be doing, shrink is done. Next up, average daily gain. And some of you may have done this in 4-H or FFA, and for some of you, this is new terminology. That's another reason it is important to make sure everyone that's studying animal science or agriculture understands these terms, because not everybody had an opportunity to raise animals, but are interested in learning more about it. So average daily gain, we usually abbreviate ADG, or average daily gain. And that is simply the final weight or the sale weight or a weight at a certain period minus let me put weight, minus the initial weight. Okay, for a time period. And you can do this as checking gains during a feeding period. You could do this at the project beginning and end, whatever situation you have. And all of that is going to be divided by the days on feed. So we're taking the gain, how much gain do these animals have, divided by days on feed. That's going to give us our average daily gain. So for Alejandro's example, those steers were fed for 150 days and finished at 1,350 pounds. Now, I personally would use the day they arrived at the feedlot weight, which was that shrunk weight of 805. So their final weight was 1,350 pounds. Their initial weight when they arrived at the feedlot was 805. And they were on feed for 150 days. So this is going to give us pounds per day that those animals gained. So if we put this into our trusty calculator, 1,350 pounds minus 805 pounds, they gained 545 pounds. I'm going to make a note because sometimes we need that total gain number. And that way we don't have to recalculate it every time. And we're going to divide that by the 150 days they were on feed. So these steers averaged about 3.63 pounds per day, which is a pretty solid rate of gain or average daily gain for a feedlot scenario. So what this tells us about feeding is, like, are the animals gaining at a rate that's acceptable for the producer? There are times we may want a slower rate of gain, like in developing heifers so they don't get too fat. We may only want to gain 1.75 pounds or under 2 pounds a day. So, or there's times that we want to push them and gain more. Totally depends on the production goals. And this is how you can use a measure to match that production goal. Okay. So average a daily gain. Now, the third one that we're going to look at is feed efficiency. Now, there's two ways to look at feed efficiency. There's the way that a lot of producers look at it, which is the pounds of feed it takes to put on 1 pound of gain. Okay, and this is kind of the practical way. However, if you're reading through the scientific journals or you want to publish in one of those, it's actually the pounds of gain per 1 pound of feed. So they flip it. So this is in a decimal form, and this is whole numbers. There is a reason, if you dig into it, that this is technically more mathematically correct than the practical way, but I teach both of them depending on what students want to do. Okay, so if we take a look at Alejandro's scenario, we do know that they consumed 3,400 pounds of feed. So in this case, we have 3,400 pounds of feed divided by the gain, which we wrote down earlier. Okay. The second one, we know that the gain that we wrote down earlier, and we're just going to flip that the numerator and denominator. We're just going to flip them. Okay. So let's see what we get for these. So let's start with the first one, 3,400 pounds of feed divided by 545 pounds of gain, feed to gain, says that these animals ate 6.24 pounds of feed to every 1 pound gained. So practically, what if we could get those animals to eat 6 pounds of feed per pound of gain? We would be improving efficiency. So in this example, the lower the number, the higher the efficiency. Okay, they're more efficient. Okay. Now, on the other example, this one here where we're going gain to feed is how much weight do they gain per pound of feed. That's where we're flipping the numerator and denominator. So in this case, it's the gain divided by the 3,400 pounds of feed. And for these steers, for every 1 pound of feed they ate, they gained, oops, let me just do pounds of feed, or pounds gained, my bad. They gained 16/10 of a pound for every pound fed. And so for this one, the higher the number, the more efficient. So what if we could get to where these animals could gain 2/10 of a pound for every pound feed we fed? That would be improving feed efficiency and reducing cost potentially, because the theory is the more efficient you can get your animals, the less waste going out into the environment and the lower the feed cost. So that's the two different methods for feed efficiency. Kind of the more practical, what's commonly been done, and then what we see in the scientific literature. All right, so let's mark feed efficiency off on our list. Okay, so you're seeing that with this one feeding scenario, there's a lot of information we can do. The next two are our initial and final values for those steers. What did Alejandro pay per steer? So we're going to do 4 and 5 right here. So that initial value. What did each steer cost him? What did he sell each steer for? Good to know. If you're wanting to look into the economics of anything, knowing what you paid and what you sell them for is a great first step. And then what expenses you put into them is that other step. So we know those animals that he paid 285 on the loading weight. I had to go back to my scenario for just a second. So Alejandro paid 285 on the loading weight. So when they bought him at the ranch, that's what he paid. So we know that those steers weighed 825 pounds, and he paid $285 per hundredweight. Now, this is the same as saying per 100 pounds. So if we divide by 100, his initial cost, they were paying $2.85 per pound. Okay, So when we talk about a hundredweight or counterweight, a hundredweight, that's 100 pounds. That's the same as $2.85 per pound. So we would simply multiply pounds times the cost per pounds. So for that initial weight, times $2.85. Each steer cost Alejandro $2,351.25. $2,351.25. That was the initial value. The same calculation concept is used for the final value, except we use the ending weight. So he sold these steers at 1,350 pounds and sold them for $230 per hundredweight. So 1,350. And remember, we can just move the decimal on the hundredweight to get dollars per pound. So he paid $230 per hundredweight, or $2.30 per pound. So that final weight, or that final cost value, each steer's final value was $3,105. So if you at least look initially, money was made from initial costs. Now the thing is we need to know how much feed cost. A lot of times you'd go into veterinary care, health issues, labor and overhead, and all these other charges are kind of going to be eaten up by that profit margin a little bit. But just getting a base understanding of initial value and final value is important. So let's look at the adjusted number sold, that in which we account for the death loss. All right, so first thing we need to remember that Alejandro purchased 500 steers in the beginning. So he had 500 steers. We also have to go back that death loss was 1.25%. Which I wish we lived in a perfect system, but biological systems are never perfect. And there always is some sort of death loss when we're feeding and caring for animals. And so understanding how we can minimize that and reduce that number is always important. So for this case, it is the formula for adjusted number sold for accounting for death loss is the total animals times, and in this case, we're going to take 1 minus the percent death loss. And one thing we need to note is this is going to be on the decimal form. So we're going to move the decimal or divide by 100. So 1, 2 spots to the left. So for Alejandro's situation, it would be that out. So for Alejandro's scenario, it would be 500 steers times 1 minus 0.0125. Okay. So if we put that into our calculator, minus whoops, that should be a times. Helps if you put in the right numbers. And that's going to be 1 minus 0.0125. Okay, now in this case, this is probably the only case I can think of in my classes where we would round down, because you can't have 3/4 of an animal sold, right? That'd be a little hard. Which 3/4 do you get? I don't know. And so what we wind up with is 493 animals sold. Okay. So basically, Alejandro lost 7 during this feeding period. That's how we would do the adjusted death loss. And so if you had a 1% death loss, 2%, depends on what species you're dealing with too, what level of death loss you may have. Sheep tend to be a little bit higher than cattle just because they're sheep and they find ways to challenge their existence, so to speak. So it's just going to depend, but that's how you would adjust for a death loss during a feeding period. All right, next up is going to be some of the financial side of it. We've done some initial and final costs, but we're going to look at total feed cost per animal next up. So this was number 6. And I also am going to put a link to a handout that describes all of these calculations for you. The University of Kentucky also has a 4-H Skillathon handbook online that has a really great reference to these equations as well. So number 7 is looking at total feed cost per animal. Okay, so if we go back to Alejandro's scenario, we know how much they ate, this 3,400 pounds, and the ration cost was $255 a ton. So we know they ate 3,400 pounds, and the ration was $255 per ton. And so first thing first is we got to be on the same units. Either this needs to be converted to pounds or to tons, or this needs to be converted to pounds. Either way should get you to the same answer. I always like to put my price on a per pound basis. So this is the same as $255 per 2,000 pounds. Where if we divide that out, we're left with pounds. And so this ration cost and I do like to go to 3 decimal places just because you get into some small numbers, but 0.128 cents per pound. So all we have to do is take the amount the animal was fed, 3,400 pounds, times the feed cost. So this is amount fed times feed cost. Pretty straightforward. Okay. So 3,400 pounds times 0.01, I messed that up already, 0.128. So this is simply the amount fed times the feed cost. Okay, so if we put that into our calculator, 3,400 times 0.128, it cost $435.80 per steer to feed them. That is the total feed cost per animal. Sweet. So that one can be marked off our list. Next up is our feed only cost of gain. Which I sometimes abbreviate cost of gain. And so we already have the numbers that we need for this. It's the feed cost, which we just did, divided by the total gain, which remember I wrote that number down from a previous problem because I was like, we're going to need it later. So I jotted it down. So our cost was $435.80. And our total gain was 545 pounds. So our feed only cost of gain, we just plug that in. Where you can see that. $0.80 per pound of gain. Now that's a way that, so if you're feeding out a second group of cattle or another group of animals, you can check your feed cost of gains to say, are you getting cheaper relative to the gain the animals are making? But then you have to understand, is it getting cheaper because your feed costs are going down, or because are they gaining more? Are they gaining less? How is all of that working? Whether it's the numerator or denominator that's making the impact on that value. But it's a good way to start figuring out and comparing feeding programs when you're trying to see optimize that economic sustainability. And there's a lot of ways to do cost of gain. If you do the total feeding period cost of gain, and that could include vet bills, it could include death loss, it could include a lot of other things that are accounted for. This is just a simple feed only cost of gain to just get you thinking about looking at your costs relative to how much an animal is gaining. Next up on our list is the break-even price. The break-even. And break-even, you can look at a per animal or per pound basis, either way. But break-even, if you are majoring in animal science at any given institution, you need to be able to do a break-even cost. And ours is going to be a very simple break-even cost. They can be more complex depending on what expenses you want to account for. For me as an applied feeder, I'm going to account for the animal cost and the feed cost. And that'll cover a good chunk of what I need to return. But most feedlots or dairies or other operations are going to include some, like all of the overhead expenses, labor, that kind of stuff into their break-even costs. So for us, it is just the initial value plus the feed cost per animal. So this is going to be a per animal way to look at it. Okay. So I want to know what I paid for them and what I spent on feed for them. And that is going to be divided by the final weight. And what this is going to tell me is what I need to sell that animal for to recover these costs. So I'm going to flip back to the initial value for a second, which we did right here. That's the 2,351.25 was our initial value. So there's our initial value plus the feed cost, which we just calculated right here. And that's going to be divided by the sale weight, which was in our scenario that he sold these for 1,350 pounds. Okay, so what this is going to give us is the cost per pound of our break even for these steers. So let's do a little plug and chug here. So 2,351.25 plus the 435.8. That means that based upon feed and the actual animal itself, Alejandro has spent $2,787.05. We're going to divide that by the sale weight. Let me put it in right into the calculator. 1350. So he needs to sell these steers for $2.06 per pound to recover the initial value and the feed cost. That's all a break even is saying. To recover these costs, this is the minimum I have to get back. Okay, now if he sells for more than that, in which case he did, because we found out that he sold for $230 a hundredweight. Okay, that's going to be profit. Break even is done. We have two left, margin and return on gain, and then we will look at a dairy example. Margin, that's the final value, which we've already calculated, times the number of animals sold. And after we adjusted for the death loss, because we can't sell those animals that didn't make it to the final weight. And then we will subtract the total cost. So if we come back here to that final value that we calculated, the $3,105, okay, that is our final value. So it will be 3,105 times the number of animals sold was 493. Then we need to do the initial cost. And we've got to remember that these initial costs right here, we need to account for every animal because you paid for every animal. And while we only fully fed out 493, how I account, because you want to be somewhat conservative in your estimates, is I would take 51.25, all of our expenses that we've got right here, times the original 500 head. So this is going to be a big number. It's our whatever we sold minus our expenses on the full 500 head, even though some died. We don't know what stage they died at, so it's hard to account for them in this kind of an example. Okay, so I'm going to plug this into the calculator kind of as it is right here. The 3105 time, let me actually put in all the parentheses and everything like we should. Times the number of animals that were sold. That's the first part of this. If I type numbers incorrectly, let me fix that. And then we're going to subtract, and I'm going to actually have my calculator calculate the cost again. I should have written it down separately when I did this other problem, but I didn't. So that is the initial value plus the feed cost. And we're going to multiply that times all 500 steers. Okay. So we should get a margin that is a positive number of $137,240. So on that group of 500 steers that Alejandro managed and sold and bought and sold, they made $137,000 profit just looking at feed and the animal values. So that's how we would calculate a margin. The last one, I'm going to kind of squeak in at the bottom of my paper, I hope, because it doesn't take up a lot of space, is our return on gain per animal. So it's our profit per animal. Okay. So we're going to do return on gain. And that is where we take the profit or loss per animal and divide that by the gain. So how I do that is I take this total margin, because this is our profit margin, the 137,240, and I divide that by the animals sold. So 137,240 divided by 493 steers. Whoops. Helps if I enter the rest of the equation. Gives us 278.38 dollars profit per steer. We divide that by the total gain, which was that number from the first page, 545 pounds. We're going to get the return, how much money we made for every pound gained by a steer. So we gained, or we profited, or we gained 51 cents per pound of gain. So for every pound those steers gained, Alejandro made 50 cents during that feeding period. Now, a lot of these numbers, they're just different derivatives of the same concept in a lot of ways. It's looking at profit per animal and looking at return on gain, all of those types of things. So as a producer, you may have the freedom to choose which values you think tells the best story for you. And I just want to make sure that you're exposed to all of these so that you have a good idea of what may come up in a conversation at any point in time. So that's kind of looking at a feedlot type scenario. The other one that we have that we need to talk about, and this is any kind of feeding. This could be sheep, cattle, pigs, dairy calves. This could be poultry. This could be any kind of animal that we're raising. These values work for. All right. The last one we have is what dairy nutritionists use for a quick evaluation, on-farm evaluation of the financial impact. Is the milk production, is the feed generating the milk production desired by the producer? And so for what the dairy uses is what's called income over feed cost. I don't know why we use over, because to me that would indicate a fraction, but it's really not. This boils down to being income minus feed cost. Oops. You'll see this as an acronym, IOFC. But that's kind of looking at like a break-even efficiency measure, like our cost of gain, some of the ones we were doing earlier, but from a dairy perspective. So I created a scenario that if we have cows milking 90 pounds per day average, and we know that milk sale price or the milk price is about $20 a hundredweight, we can calculate the income. On the flip side, we know dairies track feed intake pretty closely, and if those cows are eating 55 pounds of dry matter a day, They know the ration cost in dry matter. We can calculate feed costs. So let's start with our income element. So we know those cows are eating 90 or producing 90 pounds of milk average. And so we're in pounds, and our price is dollars per counterweight or per hundredweight. So we need to take 20 divided by 100, and that's going to tell us that milk is 20 cents a pound. That way we're in pounds and pounds. It just makes life easier to be in pounds and pounds. You could convert 90 pounds of milk to a hundredweight. You'd have a decimal. Either way will get you there. Okay, so the income is that 90 pounds times 20 cents per pound. That should give us $18 every day that cow is producing milk. Okay, all right, so now we have the income. Let's figure out our feed cost. We know they're eating 55 pounds of dry matter daily, and we know that dry matter cost, it's already in the same units. So we just have to multiply. So for feed cost, that 55 pounds times 0.12 is $6.60. So now to do our IOFC, or income over feed cost, it is simply the $18 they're making in income minus $6.60 in feed cost. So right now that dairy's IOFC is $11.40 per day per cow. Now that a lot of parameters can go into this as well. What stage of production are they at? If they're later in their lactation, this number is probably going to be smaller, meaning less income per unit of feed cost. And so understanding that these numbers are going to fluctuate throughout lactation for a dairy cow is very important. So you've got to kind of compare these numbers within a lactation stage, whether it's peak lactation, late lactation, however you need to do that. But those are going to vary across the board. But it will give you a quick indicator. Is the feed you're feeding getting you the production you need? So we went through basically 12 different measures of performance that we can utilize in feeding programs. And I guess my take-home message for people watching this video and my students that are watching it is that a graduate in animal science or in agriculture in general, they need to have you're going to be expected to interpret and apply performance and economic data. Even if you're a plant science major that may not be on livestock feeding per se, but it is going to be on some sort of crop yields, crop management, those types of things. So anybody that's going to be entering livestock production, nutrition consulting, feed sales, research, extension, ag business management, and even large animal veterinarians, you're going to be expected to apply and interpret performance and economic data. And that wraps up this episode of Applied Animal Feeding with myself, Dr. Selena Phillips.